This program was first broadcast on Canterbury's access media station, Plains FM, and was made with the assistance of New Zealand On Air.
Today, I'm lucky enough to be joined by Tracy Clelland, who's an adjunct lecturer at UC, University of Canterbury. She's going to talk to us about all of the things that we come to as parents of teenagers and the tricky kōrero that we have to have sometimes around alcohol, sex and other things that probably worries us more as parents than it does as young people. We're also going to talk about her organisation, Beyond the Birds and the Bees, and how that can support us as parents too. Thanks for joining us for Being Real Parents with me, Anna, and my colleague and buddy,
Kate. We work in the parenting space.
And it's here where we'll talk about our worlds as parents, the good, the not so good, and the hilarious, and mix this with what we know about behaviour and psychology. Tracy, it's lovely to have you here with me. Thank you so much for coming in. And and I know that I'm taking away from, really important work too. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here.
You're really welcome. So you obviously, you're an academic in the field of
relationships and sexuality education and health education. I think really my field is making sure that parents and children are connecting with each other.
That's huge, eh? Yeah. And, in my experience, one, working in this field, and two, as the parent of a teenager, there's not a lot around. Am I right about that? There's if we Googled it, I'd find some support information, but not always. It's so clouded, the space. Yeah.
Well, I think the space, actually, there's a lot of information on the internet, a lot that parents can search up. But the problem with that is it puts the parent in the position that they have to be the expert, that they have to find the right parenting skills, that there is an answer. And what we're finding with the research is that's actually taking away from parents trusting themselves and actually talking with their children. Yeah. And so although there is a lot of knowledge, which we might, information on the internet, I think parents have to put a lot more trust in their own skills. Yeah.
Is that how you came to this, through being a parent, or were you already,
Great question. So I started off as a family planning educator when I was 22. And at that point, I was working with young people but didn't have my own children. And over the last 30 years working in this field, I've had my own children. I have two sons who are now teenage boys. And I just continue to have a real passion for making sure there's much more kōrero between parent and child that actually meets the needs of both. Yeah. So a lot of the parents I worked with were feeling like they weren't good parents. They didn't know the right way to do things. And so we need to problematise that to start with. And then I would talk to young people who said that their parents wouldn't talk to them. Yeah. So both of them wanted to have a conversation, but there was a real problem in that space.
And what do you think was getting in the way of that? I mean, I can think for me, there's some embarrassment around it. Yes. There's not quite knowing where to come to in it, not feeling prepared for their questions, given that their lives are quite different to how mine were, but still similar. Yeah.
That's a great question. Like I'm just finishing my doctoral studies now, and I'll be writing a whole lot of articles and books and other things around this. Yeah. But that's such a great question because, again, a lot of the parents I interviewed around how they're talking with their children around relationships and sexuality, again, felt that same level of, am I doing it right? And embarrassment wasn't necessarily what was coming through. It was more, what if, or what would happen if I did this? They weren't trusting themselves to actually have a conversation with their child. That whole idea of, I need to protect them. But by protecting them, you're sort of telling them the right answer. Now, the problem is we're working with young people who have a different worldview. And they're really young, but they are actually living their lives. Yeah. So we need to think of education as a shared space. So this is the key thing I want to do with all my work, is help parents to take a step back, not feel that there is a right answer, but there are ways to engage with your children that make it a shared encounter. So the parent's not the expert, the child's not the expert, but together they're navigating the world, they're negotiating the world, they're thinking about the world and each person's place in that.
Nice. That's really nice.
Yeah, it is a lovely way of thinking about it.
You're listening to Being Real Parents with Kate and Anna on Plains FM 96.9.
Cool. So I love the way that you're coming at this in terms of that, you know, having these conversations. And thinking about that in a way that's who is this for, as opposed to I need to teach or I'm really worried about, so they need to know. Yeah?
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a really key point, because when a child and a parent are talking together, that is an educational encounter. So that's what we talk about in the research. Whatever happens in that space, you cannot control it. Often in our society, parents are quite scared about, you know, their children, so they're trying to fix the problem. And you can understand why, because we're parents. And I know there are times where I've gone, I shouldn't have said that, because I wasn't actually listening to my child. So if we think of a conversation between parent and child as an educational encounter, you don't know how that young person will receive that. You don't actually know how they're going to make sense of it. But if we think of as not the parent being the expert or not the child, but a shared encounter, then we can ask ourselves 3 questions. And the first question is, what is the educational encounter for? What is the point of it? Are we trying to change the child? Are we trying to give them some skills for the present moment? Are we really about trying to help them navigate an uncertain world, which I think is crucial? So what is the education for? We also then ask, who is it for? Is it for the parent trying to feel like they're doing the right thing? Or is the education actually for the child or the teenager trying to, again, help them with the skills that they need? And I'll give you an example in a moment. But just first of all, the third part is, when is it for? Now, this is a really important question for parents to think about. Are you talking about drugs, alcohol, sexuality? It doesn't matter what the topic is, but is it for now? Or is it for when they are a future sexual citizen and you're trying to protect them for the future? Because young people are making sense of the world now at this point in time. And we're sometimes as parents trying to think about the future child, but that's not where their head is. So can I give you an example?
Yeah, I'd love an example.
So in my doctoral studies, I pose a question, and the question is a question from my son. And when he was 8, 9, he asked me a question. He burst into the room and said, "Mum, what's humping?"
Good question.
Now, it's a great question, isn't it? A 9-year-old wants to know what's humping.
Yeah.
Now, if you think about those 3 questions, what is education for, when is it for, and who is it for? And now you think about, how do you answer that question? Now, this could be drugs, alcohol. It doesn't matter what the topic is. He's asking me what's humping. Now, I could answer as the expert. In other words, education's for me, because I could say, you don't need to know about that until you're an adult. Or I could say a question like, that's something that animals do.
Yeah.
But I'm still the expert. We don't actually know what that young person wants to know or how they're making sense of things. We could ask a question like, that's something that boys do to girls. Now, again, that's when you answer like that, you're actually, the education there is talking about the whole gender element. And it's actually not giving young person the chance to think about how gender impacts every day.
Yeah.
But it's that encounter is also making that young person's making sense of it. So if they ask you that question and you answer, you don't need to know about this, that young person has learnt, I can't talk to you about those questions. So you've just shut down the conversations about sex, relationships, alcohol, mental health in the future because you're saying, no, you don't need to know that yet. But let's turn it around. Let's ask those same 3 questions. What's it for? Who's it for? When is education for? And you ask that child, or you answer that child and you say, oh, that's a great question. Humping's a really interesting word. What do you think it means? Or you might say, oh, great question. Where did you hear that? Now, you're saying, I'm not the expert. You're giving that young person a chance to have a conversation with the parent. There's not the judgment. And it's hard as a parent, isn't it? Because you want to fix things. You want to make things right. And this is so challenging. So if I come back to what happened with that question, I was about to answer him, and then his brother, who's a year older, stormed into the room, I was in the room, and said, don't ask her, she'll tell you everything. And then he said, why do you want to know? And the son said, well, I heard the word in the playground and I don't know what it means.
Right.
Isn't that a beautiful question? He's trying to make sense of a word he doesn't understand. He doesn't see it to do with sex or anything. It's just a word.
Yeah.
And he feels confident to ask me to try and make sense of it. So when we put it back onto him and say, oh, great question. Well, what do you think it means? And what else could it mean? So what do we know about the word? We then start to have some korero, some open conversation.
And, I mean, it's such a beautiful age, isn't it, 8, 9, to be talking
Yes.
about this stuff rather than when they get to 14, 15, 16.
And
I love the way that what you're describing is that your son came to you open, and what it requires from us is to be open too. Yeah.
And I know this is about teenagers, but the communication you're having with teenagers starts when you are younger. Now, it doesn't mean it's too late. But what it means is we're always, it doesn't matter what age our children are, we're trying to think about those 3 questions. So as a 17-year-old, my son isn't going to come to me now and ask me what's humping. He can find that on the internet. He can find whatever he wants. But he will now have conversations with me. We talk about how he's making sense of the world. So we might be watching something on TV, a movie. We find teachable moments, don't we, as ex-teachers? So there was something on the news the other day about something happening in Iran. So my 17-year-old son and I were talking about gender and why it's different around the world. And he was so insightful. And he was teaching me around a whole lot of things that's happening in his world, but around a gender lens. And he was saying, it's interesting that he's expected to have a girlfriend because he's a teenage boy at a certain age. And he was saying, well, why would I want to? If I don't want to, I don't have to have one.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you've got to take a risk as a parent. So basically my research says we have to embrace uncertainty, not knowing how that education encounter will turn out. And it's risky. What it means is risking your role as the parent and putting some trust in your young people.
Yes, and also what I'm interested in is that my teenager is always interested in my experience, and sometimes I don't want to share it because it hasn't always been it hasn't always been roses, has it?
But life isn't roses.
No,
and if we don't also embrace some of the realities of the world and talk about how I might do things differently, etc. I think that's actually really important.
Yeah.
And again, we use a little bit of common sense as a parent, don't we?
Yeah.
We don't need to, we moderate some of those things, but we also talk about, well, what would you do in that situation? Is that similar to you? And it might be quite different for their world now. And that's what we have to be careful of. We can't put
we want it to be quite different for their world, eh?
Sometimes, because also I think we have to remember that some of the risks that we took as young people actually made us who we are. And so it's moderating those risks. Oh, yeah, so it's managing those risks.
That's true.
Look, I remember being a young person and maybe the first time, for example, I drove the car a little bit too fast. And I went round a corner and, I felt a little unsafe. But I learnt about safe driving from that moment. Now, I'm not encouraging our children to do that.
No.
But I will share that story with my son saying, And again, that's a moment that's important to share. So life is full of uncertainty and risk.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And learning through some of our own errors and being able to share those.
Yes. And we're finding for a lot of our young people now, some of the research is showing there isn't enough learning to manage the risk from a young age, so that when you're getting older, you're taking these sort of bigger risks because you haven't got the skill set.
Yeah.
You haven't built resilience.
Yeah.
That's why we teach young people to cross the road at a really young age.
Yeah.
So when they're a teenager, they know about looking both ways. And yes, we know that the brain is working differently and we have to be the guide on the side, but also taking those risks along the way, small risks that are manageable and safe risks, are part of growing up.
Yeah.
I'll give you a really good example. So when we're teaching young people to drive, we do it step by step. We just don't throw them in the car.
Yeah.
Yet when it comes to relationships and sexuality, lots of people think we're not going to talk about a child till they get to puberty. Right, now we'll have the conversation. Well, it's a one-off. Imagine if we put the child in a car for a one-off. You've got to learn to manage the risks step by step. You learn the skills, don't you? And we have to take a step back and help our young people learn the skills of communication, talking, understanding the world when they're younger. So when they're getting to that teenage, you can have that you can have that conversation.
Yeah.
It's so important.
Yeah. And being prepared to ask questions.
It's
and
open communication.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's not about sex, alcohol, all these tricky topics. Actually come back to having communication, open communication as a shared encounter.
and being prepared to be vulnerable in that.
Yes. Oh, I love that word.
Yeah.
Parents prepared to be vulnerable, and it feels difficult.
Yeah.
It is difficult.
Yeah.
Because we love our young people.
I know, don't we?
Yeah.
Tell me about the Beyond the Birds and the Bees, because I really want to make sure that that's here too.
Great. So I'm project director now for a project called Te Pua Waitanga, which means flourishing, Beyond the Birds and Bees. So we've created an online app, and now we've created a website, which will be live in about 2 months. So it's on its way.
So what time would that be?
About June.
June. Yeah.
And it's co-constructed with young people, for young people, by young people, but also for parents now and for whānau and for teachers as well. That's the ultimate game.
Wow.
So Beyond the Birds and Bees, as you can imagine, is about relationships and sexuality.
Yeah.
So it has 10 sections full of amazing information, resources, videos around topics that young people, whānau, teachers want to know about. Everything connects to New Zealand resources.
Beautiful.
So we've got topics around pornography, education and pornography, making sense about the world, how that fits in young people's worlds. Gender, relationships, communication, dating, sex, sexuality, the first time, all the questions that young people want to know, and also that parents aren't quite sure how to talk about or don't have the newer knowledge base in the digital world.
Because I think both teens, young people and parents are looking for that reputable information source, aren't they?
So we didn't want young people to go and find out something about sex by Googling sex because, imagine what turns up. So on the site are all these topics.
Just the world's worst way to find out about sex,
Yes, isn't it just?
Yeah.
So Beyond the Birds and Bees links them to all the best information from a New Zealand perspective. Yeah. And it's going to be a living, breathing site, constantly co-constructed by young people. So they're going to put up new information, new podcasts, new stories. And we've got a whole parent portal, which again has got some basic information for parents on how to talk with your children, with your children, not to your children. And again, we're going to have lesson plans for teachers. And the key thing is that it helps to support parents, teachers and young people in that space.
Yeah.
Now, if your question or your point you just made was crucial. Before we did this, we just carried out 22 focus groups with young people across Canterbury about the site and about relationships and sexuality education. Now, it wasn't about sex. That was not the most common thing they wanted to know. They wanted the skills to navigate relationships. How do I talk to my partner? How do I not how do I talk to them so I don't get shamed? And it was really beautiful. These young people were so insightful. And we've actually called the theme of the research Left to Our Own Devices.
Oh, nice.
Because one young person said, we can't talk to parents, we can't find the information, sometimes our friends aren't that trustworthy, so we're left to our own devices. Bit of a play on word, because
really
what do you
nice.
find on your device?
Yeah, quite.
How do you make sense of the world, navigate that uncertainty if we can't have those conversations as a shared space?
Yeah.
Who is education for? When is it for? I think that when it is it for is really important. What your 8-year-old, your 10-year-old, your 14-year-old wants to know, or how you talk with them, should be in the present moment.
Yeah.
How they're making sense of their life, so that as they grow and needs change, you can still have that shared conversation. It's hard. I'm not saying it's easy.
Yeah.
Ooh, some days with my own children as well, I think I should have talked about that differently. But that's okay.
Yeah,
We're
absolutely.
parents. It's not meant to be easy.
I mean, but the beautiful thing about parenting, isn't it, that I find is that often I am learning alongside my kids.
Yes.
Because there is no manual out there, and it's not, and so it's this. That is that beautiful thing about the sharing of learning to, doing that together.
And it's interesting because a lot of my parents in my research said, I wish there was a manual. But we have to be really careful with that because whose version of the manual, that doesn't take into account cultural context, ethnicity, the school the child goes to, that point in their time, at that moment in their life.
Yeah.
And it's so we can have some generic ideas of how to communicate with your children, but we also want parents to put a bit more trust in themselves.
Yeah.
It's hard.
Yeah.
But thinking of it that way is actually quite insightful for parents. I think it is.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
And that we don't have to get it right.
No, we
it's
never
an
will.
ongoing conversation.
Yeah. And a good example, I was talking with my 19-year-old son the other day about something, and he actually said to me, Mum, you're making a judgment on that person. You tell me not to do that. And I went, he's right. And he got quite grumpy with me until I said, you know what? You're right. I hadn't thought about it in that way. What do you think?
Yeah.
And then when I stepped back and thought, even though I've got all this wealth of experience, I said, give me some other ideas of some ways of thinking about that. Then he just went, and he relaxed, and we had this amazing conversation.
Yeah.
But it was me as the parent who had to step back.
And let stuff go.
Yeah. And he was really insightful about his world at this time. And he said something to me like, Mum, doesn't work like that anymore. And he was right. Because for him, it doesn't work like that at this moment in time for him. And he was actually talking about how young people navigate relationships now. And it was fascinating what I learnt from him.
Beautiful. Oh my goodness, so much to take away from this. Thank you so much. And so I've got to try and find 3 top tips. I've probably got about 20 on my notebook. But I'm going to start with that point that you made about finding something to start the kōrero with young people. And it could be something that you see on TV. It could be a series that you wanted to watch. You said that you'd asked your son to go and watch Sex Education and then come back to you about that. Yes. And he didn't ask about anal sex. He asked about a dysfunctional relationship between a parent and a kid. So interesting, eh? Number 2, I would say, would be think about the kōrero as a shared learning encounter with your young person, as opposed to needing to teach them something, feeling embarrassed, and also being able to let stuff go about how we feel and think, and be open. Yeah. And then number 3, I do love the who is this kōrero for and when is this kōrero for, because that helps us as parents reflect on how we can come at this differently and come at this openly. Yeah.
That's great. It's fabulous.
Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in again this week. For anything that we've referred to, head over to the Real Parents website, or from June, head to Beyond the Birds and the Bees for the best information around relationships and sex in our young people. You can also tune into previous episodes of Being Real Parents by going to Plains FM website and searching Being Real Parents. Thanks for being with us.
Awesome. Thanks for being with us today.
We hope you've learned that while parenting is challenging sometimes, that's totally normal. It's been fun having you with us. Keep being amazing. Bye!